Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are going to continue with our Seth material, and today we will be doing chapter 12. And here we go. Chapter 12, more on reincarnation, after death and between lives. It was just last week that John called again. Sally was in the hospital after a bad attack during which her heart had stopped for a short time. John was torn between praying for her recovery and for her release by death, and he asked if we'd have a session on the matter. Seth had often told us that when we're finished with our lives here, we're actually anxious to leave this existence. When the body is worn out, we really want to get rid of it. The instinct for survival is served quite well because the inner self knows that it lives beyond death. Still, I hated to say this to John over the phone. In theory, it sounded fine, but naturally I knew he wanted Sally to live. I knew that he hoped for some miracle, at least a partial recovery, a reprieve. I did promise to hold a Seth session for him, and later I was glad I did. Not only was the session a help to John, but it contained some excellent information on what can go on while a person is supposedly unconscious, in coma, and what we experience just before and after death. Again, at the time of the session, Sally was in deep coma. She hasn't been able to speak for over a year. First, Seth gave a page or so of impressions, names, initials, events, and so forth, that he said he derived from a certain portion of the girl's consciousness, disjointed memories, thoughts, and ideas. Her whole reality is far greater, and she's endeavoring to put these memories in place, as you would put furniture into a new house. Time, as you think of it, has little meaning for her. You could compare the two different time experiences in this way. In your dimension, it is as if remembered events were like pieces of furniture, all arranged in one room in a given order. Living in that room, you can find your way between the various pieces easily. You then move out into a larger and different kind of room, and here the furniture may be arranged in any fashion, arranged and rearranged to your heart's content. You may form different combinations from it and use it for different purposes. So Sally is rearranging the furniture of her mind. And as you might visit a new residence and move some of your belongings there before you officially make it your own, so she has been examining the new environment. She is in the process of transferring herself to a new location. There have been guides to help her. She will hardly notice that she has entirely moved in, for she will feel so at home. In her case, she has been forming memory pictures of her childhood, of days before her physical illness, and entering into them. She's learning that events that seem to be in the past can be recreated. This does not mean she thinks that she's a child. She's enjoying the freedom of re-experiencing events. This is a sort of spiritual therapy in her case, so that she loses the identification with illness and does not carry it with her. Shortly, training periods will begin. It will be her turn. It will be her turn now to help others and be their source of strength. She has already begun a new life. Therefore, Seth does not mean another physical life here, of course, though presently her experience is being monitored to some degree by guides. She sees herself supported in a religious sense by conventional figures from the Bible. These personalities will explain the nature of reality to her in vocabulary that makes sense, that will make sense to her. Again, she has solved the problems that she set and brought forth in her husband compassion and understanding, qualities that greatly help in his own development. I have appeared to her as a very gentle John of the disciples and spoken with her. This is not trickery, but a method of helping that she can accept. It is not unusual for those trying to help to assume some comforting forms and images. Later, we thought that this last statement had extremely provocative implications for cases in which visions of religious figures are reported. We hope Seth will discuss this more thoroughly in the future. During our break, Rob mentioned several questions that he thought John would like answered, or that might come to his mind as he read this session. One had to do with the kind of body Sally had at her disposal. Seth said, now the new body is, of course, not a new one at all, but simply a body, not physical in your terms, one that you use in astral projections, one that gives a vitality and strength to the physical body that you know. Your flesh is embedded in it now. When you leave the physical body, the other body is quite real to you and seems as physical, although it has many more freedoms. Sally is delighted with this body, comparing it with the sick physical one. She's trying to cut off all identification with her physical body, whether it is alive or dead in your terms. John must tell her that she is free to leave, and that he joyfully gives her her freedom, so that even after death, she does not feel she must stay close to him. She knows they will be reunited, and realizes that he is not as aware of this as she is. A few days after this session, we were visited by a retired minister and his wife. Reverend Lowe, as I'll call him, publishes a national newsletter which discusses the psychic elements of Christianity. We had been corresponding for a few years, but had not met. I told him about John's session, and he was very interested in what Seth had to say about Sally's experience while in coma. Reverend Lowe and his wife came on a class night, and so, of course, I invited them to attend. I tried to keep classes as informal as possible. Everyone is on a first name basis, and each of us wears whatever clothing is most comfortable and natural. Men in business suits mix with people in hippie outfits, and we always have wine for those who like it. I admit I wondered what Reverend Lowe would think, and hoped he didn't expect something like a prayer meeting. In our own way, we do use prayer, but in a highly creative, unstructured, unconventional manner. Sometimes we play rock and roll music, for instance, while I read a poem, and this I would consider prayer. I had no idea whether or not Seth would come through that night. In the beginning, I jokingly introduced the minister as a rock drummer to put both him and the class at ease. Someone commented that the presence of a minister must have quieted everyone down, since no one was saying much. Suddenly, Seth came through saying, and I thought you were on your good behavior because I was here. I will have to learn to be a reverend rock drummer, and I will keep the beat with you. After this, he spoke to various class members and then invited Reverend Lowe to ask whatever questions came to his mind. When we leave the physical body, where do we go? The minister asked. Everyone else sat about, sipping wine and listening. You go where you want to go, Seth said. Now, when your ordinary waking conscious mind is lulled into a sleep state, you travel in other dimensions. You travel in other dimensions. You are already having experiences in these other dimensions then. You are preparing your own way. When you die, you go into those ways that you have prepared. There are various periods of training that vary according to the individual. You must understand the nature of reality before you can manipulate within it well. In physical reality, you are learning that your thoughts have reality and that you create the reality that you know. When you leave this dimension, when you concentrate upon the knowledge you have gained, you still do not realize that you create your own reality. Then you return, and again, you learn to manipulate, and again, you see the results of your own inner reality as you meet it, objectified. You teach yourself the lesson until you have learned it, and then you begin to learn how to handle the consciousness that is yours intelligently and well. Then you can form images for the benefit of others and lead and guide them. Then you constantly enlarge the scope of your understanding. What determines the time between reincarnations? The minister asked. You. If you're very tired, then you rest. If you're wise, you take time to digest your knowledge and plan your next life, even as a writer plans his next book. If you have too many ties with this reality, or if you're too impatient, or if you have not learned sufficiently, then you may return to quickly. It is always up to the individual. There is no predestination. The answers are within yourself then, as the answers are within you now. Reverend Lowe asked other questions, but no more relating to the subject at hand. He and Seth seemed to get along very well. Later, in a break, I received several impressions of a past life of Mrs. Lowe's. While a general discussion was going on, I saw her near a riding academy in 14th century France. And then I saw her and Reverend Lowe as twins in Greece when he was an orator and she a soldier. There were other details, but the interesting thing was that Mrs. Lowe told me afterward that she was really crazy about horses and that Greece and France were the only countries in which she had any great interest. Seth rarely gives reincarnational data unless it is directly tied in with the overall development of an individual's present life. And he refuses to give past life histories, for example, to those he thinks will not apply the lessons involved. Strangely enough, he did give such information once in a class to 3 college girls who clearly did not believe in reincarnation to begin with. They had just begun classes, and while they were curious about ESP, they had little patience with the theory of reincarnation before the session, that is. The girls were all intelligent, bright, alert, and weary. They weren't about to be taken in by any mumbo jumbo. At the same time, they were intensely interested in Seth's idea that consciousness can be expanded safely and without drugs using his methods. One girl, Lydia, was the most vocal of the group in her arguments against reincarnation. Okay, sorry about that. You will reincarnate whether or not that you believe that you will, Seth began smiling. It is much easier if your theories fit reality. But if they do not, then you do not change the nature of reincarnation one iota. He went on to give Lydia a rather detailed description of a past life around the area of Bangor, Maine, in 1832 when she was a male. This was Lydia's first Seth session, and she sat wiggling nervously in her chair as Seth gave names, dates, and particular episodes of this past life. Oops. When he was finished, she said, "Well, I don't know what to say, but I'll tell you this. The crazy thing is that I spent my childhood in Bangor, Maine. And when we moved to New York State, I wouldn't give New York as my home. I always felt that I belonged in Maine." And Seth said that she broke off and read her notes. Then she said excitedly, "Seth said that a Miranda Chabot from the French side of my family in that past life married into the Franklin Bacon family of Boston. Again, it's crazy, but it really is, because my family this time is connected with the Roger Bacon family from Boston." There was no time for more discussion, though, because Seth now began to speak to Jean, the most psychically gifted of the group. She lived in Mesopotamia before it was known by that name. Here we find abilities shown, ignored, and misused through a succession of lives, a rather classic example of the progress followed by many psychically endowed, but in poor control of their personalities and abilities. In China and Egypt, lives in various religious capacities, but without the necessary sense of responsibility. Unfortunately, taking advantage of the fortunes made available to the ruling classes through the ages. For this reason, the abilities have not come to fruition. Only in this present existence is there finally some understanding and sense of responsibility. In the past, the psychic abilities were used for the wrong purposes. Therefore, they did not fully develop, and the personality was at a standstill. There was death by fire on 2 occasions. Following this statement, Seth gave details from an Irish life of Jean's in 1524. Then he went on to give the following data, which we found most interesting. I'll give it exactly as we received it, though it was somewhat confusing in the beginning, since Seth just jumped into it. A small town 25 meters from Charteris. The nearest approximation here, Charteris or Charteris. The last name then was Manupelt or Man-Alpult, a Curia. Some connection here with the first historical personality we have run across, a very distant connection to Joan of Arc, on the mystic's father side, twice removed. And that name approximately as given in some records in an old cathedral. The family name, the town, and the name of the cathedral are the same. When Seth was done for a minute, Jean wouldn't say a thing. Then she really blushed and told us that she'd always been terrified of fire, and that her nickname in high school had been Joan of Arc, or the witch. But Seth wasn't through. He gave reincarnational material for another student, Connie, and mentioned a particular life in Denmark when she had died as a small boy of diphtheria. And that really did it. Connie surprised everyone, particularly the other college girls, by saying that since she was a small child, she'd been frightened of getting diphtheria and that she could never understand why. Like, who worries about diphtheria these days, she said. If you were afraid of getting, say, cancer, I could see it, Lydia answered. That's what I mean, Connie said. I just could never make sense of it before. No one in my family ever died of diphtheria. So, along with the reincarnational history Seth had given each girl a point of information, highly significant and unknown to anyone in the room except for the person for whom it was intended. And this bit of information tied in beautifully with some small, unexplainable attitudes that had previously puzzled them. Suddenly, they were quite interested in reincarnation, and as usual, their minds were triggered fast. Now they wanted to know everything at once. Seth said earlier that all time existed at once, said Jean. Then how come he talks about reincarnational lives or a series of lives, one before the other? The two don't seem to go together. Almost immediately, Seth came through and answered her question. Your idea of time is false. Time as you experience it is an illusion caused by your own physical senses. They force you to perceive action in certain terms, but this is not the nature of action. The physical senses can only perceive reality a little bit at a time. And so it seems to you that one moment exists and is gone forever, and the next moment comes and, like the one before, also disappears. But everything in the universe exists at one time, simultaneously. The first words ever spoken still ring through the universe, and in your terms, the last words ever spoken have already been said, for there is no beginning. It is only your perception that is limited. There is no past, present, and future. These only appear to those who exist within three-dimensional reality. Since I am no longer in it, I can perceive what you do not. There is also a part of you that is not imprisoned within physical reality, and that part of you knows that there is only an eternal now. The part of you who knows this is the whole self. When I tell you that you lived, for example, in 1836, I say this because it makes sense to you now. You live all of your reincarnations at once, and you find this difficult to understand within the context of three-dimensional reality. Pretend that you have several dreams, and you know that you're dreaming. Within each dream, 100 earthly years may pass, but to you, the dreamer, no time has passed, for you are free of the dimension in which time exists. The time you seem to spend within the dream or within each life is only an illusion, and to the inner self, no time has passed since there is no time. Actually, Seth has used several analogies to explain reincarnational experiences. On page 3600 of our own sessions, I find this. The various reincarnational selves can be superficially regarded as portions of a crossword puzzle, for they are all portions of the whole, and yet they can exist separately. In the 256th session, he said, because you are obsessed with the idea of past, present, and future, you're forced to think of reincarnation as strung out one before the other. Indeed, we speak of past lives because you're used to the time sequence concept. What you have instead is something like the developments narrated in the three faces of Eve. You have dominant egos, all a part of an inner identity, dominant in various existences. but the separate existences exist simultaneously. Only the egos involved make the time distinction. 145 BC, AD 145, 1,000 years in your past, and 1,000 years in your future all exist now. In fact, Seth gave 3 or 4 sessions in which he compared cases of, quote, split personalities to our reincarnation selves. He ended up by saying, it is interesting that the personalities in the 3 faces of Eve did alternate, and all were in existence at once, so to speak, even though only one was dominant at any given time. In the same way, so-called past personalities are present in you now, but not dominant. As far as we know, this reconciliation of reincarnation in simultaneous time is original with Seth. Most other theories of reincarnation take the time sequence for granted. But what about cause and effect then? When Seth introduced this idea, this is one of the first questions Rob and I thought of. Seth's attitude toward cause and effect will become clear enough in his later explanations of the true nature of time. But when Rob first asked the question, Seth answered, since all events occur at once in actuality, there is little to be gained by saying that a past event causes a present one. Past experience does not cause present experience. You are forming past, present, and future simultaneously. Since events appear to you in sequence, this is difficult to explain. When it is said that certain characteristics from a past life influence or cause present patterns of behavior, such statements, and I have made some of them, are highly simplified to make certain points clear. The whole self is aware of all of the experiences of all of its egos. And since one identity forms them, there are bound to be similarities between them and shared characteristics. The material I have given you on reincarnation is quite valid, particularly for working purposes, but it is a simplified version of what actually occurs. So Seth often explains present life problems as a result of past life difficulties. He makes it clear to those that can understand that the lives really exist simultaneously, just as 3 personalities can exist in one body at one time. But all problems are not the result of such, quote, past life influences. In one case, a friend's hang-ups in the present originated right in this life, though her boyfriends were left over from the past. Doris was having all kinds of problems. For one thing, she kept falling head over heels in love with men who didn't want marriage under any circumstances. In these relationships, she was the aggressor. The men in each case were men who did not date, were overly attached to their parents, and for some reason or other did not have ordinary relationships with women. Doris was smart enough to see this, but each time she was certain that there was something about the new man that made him more eligible, or at least more eligible to accept her advances. Oh, okay, sorry, lost my place there. Okay. In the meantime, she was dreadfully lonely, for she would refuse dates with, quote, ordinary men, since they seemed so inferior compared to the new idol. Finally, after the breakup of one such episode, she asked for a Seth session. She knows both of us well, so I was quite astonished at her behavior before the session. She was so uptight that I found it difficult to go into trance. She just sat there, really white-faced, unsmiling, looking quite terrified. Seth began by saying gently, your feelings toward me are connected with other attitudes deeply ingrained within you. You have been afraid of your father since infancy. Now you think of me as an old but wise, extremely powerful male adult, as you thought of your father when you were a child. This attitude overshadows your relationships with males with whom you come into contact. You see the male in terms inspired in you in this childhood. You felt that your father had godlike qualities and attempted to project these onto the men you meet. Therefore, they disappoint you. But this also serves your needs. Because while you see the male as godlike, you also see him as one who gives out punishment. and as unreasoning and cruel. So you are afraid to, quote, come under a man's thumb or domination. Because you were a male in past lives, you resent this all the more. Therefore, you consistently choose men in whom you see feminine characteristics, hoping that these more gentle qualities will protect you against the other feared masculine traits that you will have exaggerated. From what Rob said earlier, Doris sat there red-faced and somewhat embarrassed. A tape recorder was on. Seth went on, citing examples from Doris's early life in which Rob and I knew nothing. The entire session took up 9 pages of single-type copy, in which Seth analyzed Doris's attitudes and traits, illustrating them with specific episodes formerly known only to her, and ending up with some excellent advice. He told her that she was projecting this image upon each male she met, and then reacting to it instead of to the individual. He gave her some mental exercises calculated to help her dissolve this false image. Here, Doris began to cry a little. Seth smiled and said, Now, do not sniffle. I am not your father giving you an arithmetic lesson. I put myself out to help you, and for this I get tears. I usually don't have that effect on people. In answer, Doris managed to grin. You can ask questions, Rob said. Well, then why doesn't Frank, not his real name, date and have ordinary relationships with women? He's manly enough, she said. Then, almost with a touch of defiance, she added, he's not effeminate. And in this case, the main problem lay in, quote, past life troubles. He was a woman. His present parents were his brothers in the American Revolutionary period in the same geographical area as now. His brothers were involved as spies. Your Frank, as their sister, disclosed their hiding place in a cellar beneath an old inn. She was captured when she went out for supplies, gave away the location, and could not warn the brothers. She felt she had abandoned and betrayed them. Seth went on to say that in this life, Frank chose to return as the son of the 2 brothers who themselves are now man and wife. Now he rationalizes his desire not to leave home. The brothers never held him responsible. They knew the girl had been terrified and spoken out of fear with no intent to betray them. There is no punishment involved. He has chosen in this life to be of service to them and to help others. His secrecy, he was very tight-lipped, is the result of these past experiences. Once he feels he spoke too much and betrayed too much, now he is secretive about matters he considers important. Seth emphasized that for his own reasons, Frank did not want a marriage relationship, and ended by telling Doris that she had chosen him for this reason, that she never saw the man as he was, but only the image she had projected upon them. He gave Frank's name in a past life as Achman, incidentally, and much later Doris learned that his present family has an Achman branch. Much more psychological advice was given. The whole session was of great help to Doris, who hasn't been frightened of Seth since, by the way. But it is an oversimplification to say that all present problems are the result of past life difficulties. We are not, quote, stuck with our problems, whether they come from this life or another. We don't have to drag them along with us. They can be solved. And while reincarnational influences certainly operate, they don't operate in a vacuum. The following chapter on health will contain some of Seth's methods for maintaining mental, psychic, and physical vitality and perspective. Some people are better able to utilize past experiences, I think, while others insulate themselves rather closely in each life, closing themselves off as much as possible from such influences. Some people's lives seem to make no sense, for instance, unless you know their, quote, previous ones. Our 50 or 60 or 70-year lifespans are like self-contained novels, well plotted and executed. There is no doubt, though, that a knowledge of reincarnational influences sheds invaluable light on the nature of personality and helps us see our present selves with some perspective. The following excerpts from a reincarnational reading show the continuity, and interrelationships that can be involved in the tapestry of the self we now call ours. An editor I'll call Matt came to visit us from New York. We had corresponded but never met before. He had read a manuscript of mine and knew about Seth. We liked each other at once, but it was primarily a business meeting. And then I felt that Matt would want me to, quote, prove my ability somehow or other, and I didn't want to feel under pressure. Some people I've discovered have the strangest ideas about mediums or psychics. When I first found this out, I used to knock myself out proving how normal I was. People usually found this very disappointing, and I find it very inhibiting. Now, most of this has just worn off. I'm as normal or abnormal as anyone else. Actually, it was kind of funny. Matt knocked himself out to show me that I didn't really have to prove a thing. So for a while, our conversation was rather bright and frantic. Seth had previously given us some information about Matt, his publishing company, and his associates. And the next evening, when we were all more comfortable with each other, Seth came through and held an excellent session. Matt had since become a good friend instantly, but at that point, we didn't know him from Adam. The psychological insights shown were really just astonishing. And I don't believe that the most accomplished psychologist could have pinpointed this young man's character, abilities, and liabilities as well as Seth did. My eyes were open during much of the session, my physical eyes, that is, because at such times they were definitely mirrors of a different personality. There has been a sense of void to be filled, Seth began, a fear of identity escaping and running outward. My cup runneth over, and there will be none of me left, you see? On the other hand, it has always been natural for the personality to return outward in an easy manner with exuberance. So we find two lives devoted to the nature of others, but in both cases, the personality was filled with an inner dread, to some extent resenting those he helped. If he were out helping others, then who would mind the store? He was afraid his stock would be gone. In two other lives, there was instead the development of inner abilities to the exclusion of others, a closing down of windows and barring of doors. He would not look out, and no one dared look in. He would make horrible, funny faces at the window of his soul to frighten others away. Yet through all of this, the inner abilities did grow. He added to his stock. Now he has begun to synthesize these inner and outer conditions. He realizes that the inner self need not be so heavily guarded that his identity will not escape from him like a dog who leaves the leash. Now you see that I am a friendly chap, indeed, like an old dog with a long leash. At this, Rob and Matt both burst out laughing. Then Seth went into some information, connecting some of the young man's present interests with past activities. He mentioned several past lives, but emphasized one as being particularly significant. You were a member of a monastic group who classified and collected various kinds of seeds. The group worked on manuscripts officially, but our friend here and several others were bootleg seed finders, believing against currently held theories about questions concerning nature could be answered by examining nature. They investigated the ideas, folklore, and officially held knowledge concerning botany and seed reproduction, and began behind the monastery their forbidden garden. They were trying to discover the secret of heredity within plant life. This was near Bordeaux. The order had to do with St. John. There was a crest belonging either to the order or to our friend's family, a four-tongued fork with a serpent above the upper portion of the handle in the foreground, and in the background, either a castle or monastery. The monks were routed out of the order in the 1400s. The name of the monk in the order seems to have been Errol-France Marie, Rob's phonetic interpretation. How did I die then? Matt asked. 3 villagers were hunting on monastery ground. You yelled out to them that they trespassed and tripped on a rock. You were knocked unconscious and the townspeople ran. You came to at night and wandered through the fields on the far side of the monastery and came to a body of water. You knelt and began to pray and lost your balance. You grabbed hold of an overhanging branch, but it gave way and you drowned. At this point, as Seth talked, I seemed to be looking down on the scene he described. I watched the monk from some point behind and above, and as he wandered away from the monastery and through the fields, Seth went on to say that the monk's experiments contributed to achievements made later in the same field by another monk. He also gave some excellent advice that I'm sure many other people could use. Do not use your intellect like a shiny banner to wave from your windows. You're using it like a gaudy plaything that belongs to you. You wind it up like a fine toy, but you're careful of the directions in which you let it run. Your intellect is a fine one, but you have allowed yourself to be fascinated by its sparkling quality and not use it thoroughly as a tool. I'm only giving excerpts from personal readings, picking out passages that deal with reincarnation. Usually the readings themselves include far more, health suggestions, as well as character analysis and advice on other matters. And so far, with each such session has been highly significant to the person concerned. Matt, for instance, was astonished by the character analysis, which he had pegged him to a T. More, the crest mentioned by Seth was highly similar, he told us, to his own private doodle that he sketched while on the phone or in odd moments. Another interesting point, a few years earlier, the editor had written 2 plays, one featuring a monk who lived on a seacoast near Bordeaux, and the other also set in France in the 13th century. These facts, of course, were unknown to us. We did know that the editor was interested in botany, however, and Seth tied in this avocation with the past experimental work done with seeds. I've tried, through excerpts from readings, to show Seth's ideas on reincarnation as they were personally applied. But there are several important questions we haven't considered as yet. For example, how many lives do we have? Is there a limit to them? Quite simply, we live as many physical experiences as we feel we must in order to develop our abilities and prepare ourselves to enter other dimensions of reality. This will be discussed thoroughly in the chapter dealing with the nature of personality. Within this framework of development, however, there is a minimum requirement, Seth says. As a rule, each entity is born so that 3 roles are experienced, that of mother, father, and child. 2 lives would be sufficient to give you the 3 roles, but in some cases, the personality does not function to adulthood. The most important issue, however, is the fullest use of potential. Seth also told us that some personalities do not develop well in the physical environment, but fulfill themselves in other realities. In other words, the quote, last reincarnation is not the end. There are other dimensions of existence in which we have an even greater part to play in the maintenance of life and consciousness. These dimensions and our part in them will be explained along with the God concept, probabilities, and time. But central to Seth's discussion of reincarnation are the following excerpts from session 233 that place reincarnation in perspective, individually and historically. In the materialization of personality through various reincarnations, only the ego and the layers of personal subconscious adopt new characteristics. The other layers of the self retain their past experiences, identity, and knowledge. In fact, the ego receives much of its relative stability because of this subconscious retention. Were it not for past experiences in other lives on the part of the deeper layers of the self, the ego would find it almost impossible to relate to other individuals, and the cohesiveness of society would not exist. Learning to some extent is passed on through the genes biochemically. But this is a physical materialization of inner knowledge achieved and retained from past lives. The human being does not erupt into existence at birth and laboriously then begin its first attempt to gain experience. If this were the case, you would still be back in the Stone Ages. There are waves of energy and waves of reincarnational patterns, for there have been many Stone Ages on your planet, where new identities did begin their first experience with physical existence and changed the face of the earth as they progressed. They changed it in their own ways, not in your way, but this will be discussed at a much later date. Yet all of this occurs basically within the blinking of an eyelid, all with purpose and meaning, and based upon achievement and responsibility. Each part of the self, while independent to some considerable degree, is nevertheless responsible to every other portion of the self, and each whole self entity is responsible to all others. While it is largely independent as to activity and decision. For as many layers of the self compose the whole self entity, so many entities form a gestalt of which you know relatively little, and of which I am not as yet prepared to tell you. This last remark was to lead much later into whole blocks of sessions dealing with the God concept. We are still having sessions that deal with reincarnation, and when questions come up, we ask them. This helps to add to our material on the subject, of course, but yet in the entire fabric of the sessions, reincarnation plays a comparatively minor part, as only one aspect of our reality. Whether or not you understand or accept your reincarnational background, it is highly important to live a sane, balanced life in this life. We form our day-to-day reality. We formed our past lives, and we form this one. And by solving problems now, we can make things vastly easier for our quote past and quote future selves. End of chapter 12. Wow, this is some chapter about reincarnation. It's really fascinating. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining us, and we will continue next week for chapter 13. In the meantime, have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.